Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Virginia Mastriegos, and I am a tenant protection advisor here at the Renters Helpline. Are the following: landlord's right to enter. So, when a landlord wants to enter your home or the unit, it is required that a 24-hour written notice be given to the tenant. So, there's three things that should be on that notice. One is the date and approximate time and the purpose of entry. So this notice should be given to the tenant either hand delivered or posted to the door. It can be mailed, but obviously would have to give the tenant more than a 24-hour notice because of the process of mailing. So in other words, it has to be a paper notice that the tenant receives. It should not be a phone call or a text message or an email. Repairs are also a common concern, and so every unit must be habitable. So the landlord is responsible for maintaining the habitability of the unit. Landlord is not responsible for damages caused to the tenant. So the normal wear and tear of things is what the landlord is responsible for, but if the tenant obviously breaks something, then it is the responsibility for the landlord to fix those, but has the right to bill the tenant for the repairs. This is also a common one: security deposit questions. A security deposit is an amount of money that a tenant pays the landlord prior to moving into the rental. And what the limits are is if the unit is furnished, California limits the security deposit to 3 times the rent. So that's if it's furnished. And then if it's unfurnished, California limits the security deposit to 2 times the monthly rent. So we're going to move on to rent increases. So the rent can be increased annually by 5% plus CPI or Consumer Price Index, but cannot exceed 10%. Now, there are some type of housing that are excluded from this protection. So not all rentals have this rent increase protection. So the type of notices that should be served to the tenant is either going to be a 30-day notice of rent increase or a 90-day notice of rent increase. And the difference is in the amount being increased. So if the increase is 10% or less, a 30-day notice is required. If there's going to be an increase of more than 10%, a 90-day notice is required. And these notices should come in 2 ways to the tenant. One is either hand delivered or mailed to the residence. If it's going to be mailed to the residence, the landlord must allow 5 days if they're mailing it from California. If it's outside of California, say the landlord lives in New Jersey, they have to allow an extra 10 days for the process of getting it to the tenant via mail. Termination of tenancy notices. Landlord must give you a reason for termination for protected properties. Here, the keyword is protected. Just like rent increases, not all properties and or tenants fall under these protections. So if the unit is protected and the tenant is protected, if all the moving parts fall in place, then landlord must give the tenant a reason for termination of tenancy. And these are the types of notices in our area that can be served to a tenant for terminating the tenancy. So it could be either a 30-day, a 60-day, a 90-day, or a 20-day notice of termination. These notices must be either hand delivered, posted, and or mailed to the tenant. So if you kind of get like the trend here, all notices that we've so far talked about must be a paper notice. So I can't stress enough that an email or a text message or a phone call are not appropriate for rent increases or termination of tenancies or notices to enter the unit. And so we're back to refund of security deposits. So under California law, the landlord has 21 days from when the tenant moves out to either send a full refund of the security deposit or provide an itemized statement that lists the amounts of any deductions from the security deposit along with copies of receipts. The receipts are only required for any deduction over 126. So let's just say it costs a landlord $50 to patch a hole in the wall. That needs to be on the itemized statement, but no receipt is required. However, they hired a cleaning service that costs $150, and so that should still be on the itemized statement, but that there should be a receipt included because that expenditure or deduction was over 126. The Renters Helpline, helps to identify housing discrimination. And what is housing discrimination? Sometimes we get tenants that are upset because they haven't received, they haven't had a repair done, and they want to talk to Fair Housing because they feel that it's unfair that they pay their rent every month, yet these necessary repairs are being ignored by their landlords. In this example, this is not a fair housing issue. It is unfair, but it's not a fair housing issue. So what is fair housing? Fair housing is a term for the laws that prevent discrimination in housing. Housing discrimination happens when housing providers treat applicants or tenants differently because of a specific characteristic. Excuse me. So these are the protected categories: race, religion, sex, national origin, disability, family status, age, source of income, sexual orientation, gender identity, marital status, veteran and military status, immigration status, and first language. So prohibited activities. So refusing to rent a unit, falsely denying availability of housing, setting different terms, conditions, or privileges, providing different services or facilities, and advertising in a way that shows preference. So this is an example of a sign that shows preferences or is a blanket statement. So please, children must be supervised at all times. This would be housing discrimination. The category would be familial status. Children have the right to have the right of quiet enjoyment, which means they have the right to enjoy their surroundings in their homes. And not all children need to be supervised, right? You might have to supervise at all times a 3-year-old versus a 15-year-old. So this is why the sign is could get somebody fined for a fair housing. And along with fair housing, we think about discrimination because of the protected categories that we just looked at. Well, some housing discrimination is when somebody with a disability asks for a reasonable accommodation or a reasonable modification, and they're denied. And then that would fall under fair housing based on a disability. So let's talk about reasonable accommodations for a moment. And what are reasonable accommodations? So it's a change in rules, policies, practices, or services which may be necessary to enable a person with a disability an equal opportunity to obtain, use, and enjoy his or her home. So simply put, it's an exception. You're making an exception. You're making a reasonable accommodation. So these are examples of reasonable accommodations that are very common. A service for a companion animal or an ESA, emotional support animal, a caretaker or live-in aid, a change in rent due date. So this is common for, say, folks that receive benefits like disability benefits. And for example, we could have a tenant that has disability benefits that come in on the 5th of every month, yet their lease agreement says that they have till the 1st. And so at this point, this person would be late constantly because of when their benefits come in. So a reasonable accommodation would be to ask the landlord to move their due date to, let's say, the 7th, so they have plenty of time to get their rent in. So this cannot be denied by a landlord. If the landlord says, nope, everybody's rent is due on the 1st and there are no exceptions, that would be a fair housing violation because, and again, based on disability. So breaking your lease early or breaking lease early, again, this is a reasonable accommodation. Sometimes people are in fixed term leases and something happens and they have to break their lease because maybe now they're disabled or their health has deteriorated so bad they can't no longer take care of themselves and stay in the unit, live independently. So again, this would be a reasonable accommodation to break the lease early and that person would not pay penalties. Most reasonable accommodations do require a doctor's note, and there's 2 reasons. One, to prove the claim, and the other is, depending on the severity of the disability, you could get more of an extension of time. This would be the last example where it says extension of time, but it would be if a person with a disability got, let's just say, a 60-day notice to terminate their tenancy, but because they're disabled, they could request for a reasonable accommodation for an extension of time, and depending on the disability, they could get 1-month extension or an 8-month extension. So that's why the doctor's note is really important in that case. So parking spaces is also a reasonable accommodation that can be done, and transfers. So transfers would be if, say, somebody was on the 3rd floor and because of their health condition and or disability need a unit on the 1st floor. And so service and companion animals, these types of animals do not require or don't have to be trained or certified. No breed restrictions or size limitations. So you could have a Chihuahua or a Great Dane or a pet bull. There are no limitations. Cannot require additional security deposit for pet or pet rent, because these animals are not viewed as pets, they're viewed as medically needed. The 2 things that landlords can request is good behavior, and then they can deny a specific animal for known history of aggression, like if that animal has been aggressive towards other tenants and things like that. So good behavior. The other thing that they can request is vaccination, proof that the ESA animal has all their shots and are current on all their shots. So that's another thing that they can require, the landlords can require. So reasonable modifications. So these are modifications to the unit. So somehow the tenant is wanting to change the structure of the unit. So some reasonable accommodations, same as reasonable accommodations, except this is a physical change to the unit. Tenants pay for these modifications unless the property is federally funded. Landlords have the right to approve plans and ensure the competency of the contractor. Landlord cannot increase the security deposit, but the landlord can require the tenant to return to its original state.